In F. Scott Fitzgerald's Month in Montana, Race, Class, and Western Mythology in The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, scholars Stu Wilson and Mel Barker, will explore newly discovered information on Fitzgerald's Montana visit, place it into a broader historical context, and highlight connections between Fitzgerald, the Diamond, and three prominent Montanans linked to White Sulphur Springs: John Ringling, Michael Donahoe, and Emmanuel Taylor Gordon. Dr. Mel Barker and Stu Wilson co-founded and co-chair the organization Fitzgerald in St. Paul, which celebrates author F. Scott Fitzgerald in his hometown. Dr. Barker holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Oregon. Stu Wilson holds a MA in architectural history and currently researches Fitzgerald in Montana.
Thank you, Annalise, and thank you everybody for coming in to hear us this morning. And I hope you can hear me anytime I seem to fade out if someone in the back would wave a hand or something. Stu and I are very pleased to be here today to present on the famous author F. Scott Fitzgerald and his connections to Montana. Today, we'd like to focus on just a few highlights of what is a much, much larger research project. So if you're ready, imagine this scene. A man in a splendid uniform embellished with gold and gemstones. He carries a colonel's sword with a jewel-encrusted hilt. On his face is a look of desperate determination, bordering on madness. Behind him are men his family has enslaved for generations. They follow him obediently up a mountain, carrying an enormous cargo. The bearers strain under the weight of the treasure they carry. The man and his party reach a clearing, and the man steps forward to declare his intent. He has climbed the mountain to bargain with God, to convince the Almighty, to let him keep his riches and his slaves. In his madness, driven by greed, he thinks that God will favor him. But as the dawn light fills the sky, airplanes appear on the horizon. And despite his extreme efforts, including assassinations, enslaving people for generations, deceiving government surveyors, the secret of his hidden treasure has reached the outside world. In one desperate act, having received no sign from the Almighty, the madman blows up a diamond mountain and everything nearby. Well, if this plot sounds familiar to you, it might be because you read it in a Mickey Mouse comic book, or heard the Orson Welles version, or recognize it as a plot element in almost every James Bond movie, or even heard it in a Jimmy Buffett song. The story of a powerful man protecting his astonishing wealth sounds like the ultimate arch-villain scenario. But long before Walt Disney, Orson Welles, Ian Fleming, or even Jimmy Buffett, F. Scott Fitzgerald published this story in 1922. And while some of you may even know the story, it's called The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. What you may not know is it is based on Montana locations and Montana history. So today we will look at the origin of Fitzgerald's Diamond Mountain story and the likely model for that arch villain, as well as explore some connections to the Confederacy and Montana's African American community. We'll also identify the very compelling reasons why Fitzgerald wrote this story. Now, I have to tell you, many aspects of the story have been seriously misinterpreted, but with the help of some great local history resources, we can now get a more accurate picture of the Montana story behind the story. Switcheroo.
Do a little dance here. To begin with, let me tell you a little bit about Fitzgerald, The Diamond as Big as a Ritz, and his masterpiece, The Great Gatsby. Acclaimed author F. Scott Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1896. He became famous as the voice of his generation with the publication of This Side of Paradise in 1920. Scott and his wife Zelda were the symbols of the jazz age. During his life, Fitzgerald wrote 5 novels, published over 160 short stories, and worked on many movie scripts, including Gone with the Wind. Fitzgerald ended his career working in Hollywood and died tragically at only age 44 in 1940. Here are pictures of the young Scott, his birthplace in St. Paul, and Scott and Zelda circa 1920, shortly after their marriage. Fitzgerald's masterpiece, The Great Gatsby, was published in 1925, and it will soon celebrate its centennial. Why is The Great Gatsby important, you might ask? First, it's considered one of the best American novels of all time. It is the most read American novel outside of the United States and has been translated into more than 50 languages. It has had 4 major motion picture adaptations. And finally, the book's themes of wealth and privilege remain highly relevant today. The Diamond as Big as the Ritz was first published 3 years earlier in 1922. Scholars consider it one of Fitzgerald's best stories and an important precursor to The Great Gatsby. It is unusual for a Fitzgerald story. It is his only story set in a remote Western location, and it is one of a handful of stories that is seen as a fantasy or allegory. Most of his stories are more realistic. Also, it is one of his few stories to have a significant presence of Black characters with specific references to slavery and the Civil War. Diamond as Big as the Ritz begins with a college student named John Unger visiting the Montana home of his college roommate, Percy Washington. The Washington's home turns out to be a secret enclave with a luxurious chateau on top of a diamond mountain. The mountain was discovered by Percy's grandfather, who was a Confederate colonel. The Washington family is served by a faithful contingent of slaves brought from the Deep South. John Unger doesn't know this when he arrives, but no one ever is allowed to leave the Diamond Mountain. At the end of the story, airplanes discover the mountain, and rather than sharing his wealth, Percy's father, Braddock, blows up the mountain. At its core, Diamond has a story about one family's monopolistic control over wealth and their unconstrained power. The family is willing to take any and all measures to maintain their fortune, including enslaving, imprisoning, and executing anyone who stands in their way. On the screen is the little Fitzgerald wrote about his Montana adventure in the summer of 1915. These cryptic phrases are from Fitzgerald's ledger. His ledger was a month-by-month account of his whole life that he kept. Rather than a diary, these are notes to himself for future writing projects and are very often misinterpreted. You can see how cryptic they are. Largely based on just the first short ledger entry where Fitzgerald mentioned Sape's Ranch, and the only photo of him during his Montana visit, which you see here. Fitzgerald's trip has been interpreted as a brief visit to a remote ranch with few amenities. Scholars, mainly from the East Coast, have concluded that he spent his time working as a cowboy. Without really understanding Montana or its history, biographers have jumped to these conclusions, largely based on common mythologies about the West. These include the belief that the West is always about cowboys, is underdeveloped, has little racial diversity, and has minimal class differences. Thus, the inspirations for Diamond as Big as the Ritz have been seen as coming from Fitzgerald's imagination, and that his Montana visit wasn't really meaningful to the story or his writing career. But we have found that the opposite of that is actually true. Fitzgerald's stay in Montana in 1915 was central to almost every aspect of the Diamond story, and further, it was a critical period in his development as a writer and his understanding of wealth and class.
In this section of our presentation, I will look at more details on Fitzgerald's visit in the summer of 1915. Let's start with Charles Sape Donahoe, Fitzgerald's lifelong friend and his roommate at Princeton. Sape was Scott's host on his visit to Montana in 1915. SAPE, by the way, is short for Homo sapiens, or thinking man, a clever nickname given to Charles by his Catholic school friends who were forced to take Latin. Previously, it was thought that Scott and SAPE were at the Donahoe's ranch for a very short time, maybe less than a month. But through our newspaper research, we learned that they were here for more than 2 months. Also, that they were joined by SAPE's older brother, Harry, and another Arizona friend, Frank Brophy. Both Harry and Brophy were students at Yale, but all 4 of the boys were friends from the elite Catholic prep school, the Newman School, that they had attended in New Jersey. The group of visitors also included the Donahoe's maternal uncle, businessman Henry Malloy. We also discovered that all but Scott had deep family connections to Western copper mining operations. And as we'll demonstrate in just a minute, this fact alone qualitatively changes the nature and the impact of Fitzgerald's stay in Montana. It transforms the favorite narrative of a rugged cowboy summer spent roughing it on a remote ranch into something quite different. The Donahoes owned the Castle Mountain Ranch near White Sulphur Springs. They acquired it by 1903, and by 1915, when Fitzgerald visited, it was a large landholding, 45,000 acres, and a very, very large business operation with 20 to 30 employees, 2,800 cattle, and 4,500 sheep. However, the Donahoes were non-resident owners, and they did not stay at the ranch. Conveniently, they also owned the stone castle in White Sulphur Springs. It was the largest and most luxurious house in White Sulphur Springs, and when the Donahoes visited, usually for 2 to 3 months every summer, they stayed at their castle. Thus, although Fitzgerald and the other boys may have visited out at the ranch, they stayed in town and had a largely town experience with many high-class amenities. Our research, based on other clues from Fitzgerald's ledger, indicates that they saw the latest blockbuster movies. They attended theater events. They enjoyed a dip at the hot springs on a regular basis. They went drinking and gambling at local card parlors, and they courted the 2 most eligible young women in White Sulphur Springs. Hardly roughing it, and certainly not lonely. How did the Donahoes come to own these substantial White Sulphur Springs properties? Michael Donahoe, SAPE and Harry's dad, was not a copper king. However, he was most certainly a copper duke, and the Donahoe family played a significant role in Montana business history. Michael Donahoe was one of the trusted lieutenants of Copper King Marcus Daly, and by 1899, Donahoe was named as the chair of the Anaconda Board of Directors, and he was poised to lead the Anaconda Company upon Daly's expected retirement. The Donahoe family lived in Anaconda for nearly 10 years, and all 4 of their children, Harry, Charles, Kathleen, and Walter, were born there. They owned a large 5-bedroom home right across the street from Marcus Daly. And in addition to his role at the Anaconda Mining Company, Michael Donahoe was busy developing several other Montana businesses, including 2 prominent banks, the Butte Anaconda Pacific Railroad, and he was the owner of the Butte Brewery. Here are some of Michael Donahoe's business interests in Montana. And you should know that as soon as they finished their college educations, his sons were expected to return to Montana to take over these businesses. So while their summer breaks in White Sulphur Springs were for fun, it also provided the Donahoe sons an opportunity to learn more about businesses that they would soon be expected to lead. In short, Fitzgerald's rugged, lonely cowboy summer was actually spent at a luxurious stone castle with 3 Ivy League college buddies, all of whom were heirs to some substantial business interests derived from money from copper interests.
I love that Fitzgerald's friend owned a brewery. And I want to look at the real place that inspired the Diamond story. In the middle of the Big Belt Mountains, Diamond City is a ghost town today. The name, for obvious reasons, immediately got our attention, but the parallels of the history of the real place with Fitzgerald's story are uncanny. Diamond City and the narrow canyon it is in, Confederate Gulch, are about 30 miles from White Sulphur Springs. In 1915, Diamond City was on a commonly traveled road between Helena and White Sulphur Springs, an easy day trip for visitors, and still quite well known. The area was discovered in 1864 by 3 ex-Confederate soldiers and an Englishman. They struck gold. It was a fabulously rich find in a remote, isolated location. The leader of the 4 was named Washington Baker, a name that echoes that of the deranged patriarch Braddock Washington in Fitzgerald's story. Diamond City was named because the center of the initial encampment had a large diamond-shaped rock that the miners had to walk around. The big rock and the diamond name are obvious elements in Fitzgerald's story. Confederate Gulch was given its name by the founders who believed that the South would win the war. Remember, the Civil War was still ongoing. Montana was just a territory, and the founders were claiming it for the Confederate States. Diamond City actually remained a Confederate settlement for 2 years past the end of the war. In 1867, a Quaker from Maine named Charlie Cook, after receiving approval from the Confederate colonel who ran the town, courageously raised the U.S. flag for the first time. Later, Cook moved to White Sulphur Springs. He often recounted stories from his Diamond City days, and it's thus likely that he interacted with Scott directly. In his story, Diamond as Big as the Ritz, Fitzgerald wrote that the Washington family controlled their slaves by telling them that the South had won the war, and described the Washington's mountain retreat as, quote, beyond the United States, just like Diamond City. Overall, Fitzgerald's whole line of Confederate characters and plotting in The Diamond as Big as the Ritz parallels very accurately the real history of Confederate Gulch and Diamond City. In the 1880s, as the gold began to run out, many Diamond City residents moved to White Sulphur Springs. Many people that Fitzgerald interacted with, in addition to Charlie Cook, also had Diamond City backgrounds. We don't know for sure, 100% for sure, if Fitzgerald visited Confederate Gulch, but it seems likely, and there's absolutely no question, given all of the parallels with his story, that he knew the history of Diamond City in writing his story.
I want to turn my attention now to our most surprising finding related to Fitzgerald's visit and the story, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. For a long time, Stu and I were puzzled by a mysterious entry in Fitzgerald's ledger, Butte's payroll. What could this phrase mean? Well, here's the short answer. Butte's payroll is a reference to dramatic wage increases in 1915 for the workers in Butte. The Anaconda mine had just changed ownership and wages were increased by a whopping 25%. Here are a few examples of the dozens and dozens of headlines from the Montana newspapers for the summer of 1915 touting the wage hikes. And as an avid newspaper reader, this news would have been hard for Scott Fitzgerald to miss. But why was this phrase so meaningful for Scott Fitzgerald? Why did he jot it down in his ledger and think about it as a story idea? To further understand the context for the wage increase, we need to return to the era of the Copper Kings. In 1900, Marcus Daly died just as Michael Donahoe was poised to lead the Anaconda Corporation. At this critical juncture, the Rockefellers swooped in and manipulated stock prices and launched a hostile takeover of the company. They then held the state of Montana in virtually a stranglehold for nearly 15 years as they attempted to create a worldwide copper monopoly. John D. Rockefeller Sr. was the head of Standard Oil and was the world's first business billionaire. He was the wealthiest person in the world in 1915, and thus clearly served as a model of a wealth-obsessed oligarch in the story Diamond. Like Napoleon, he extended his empire by placing his relatives at the head of other businesses. He placed his son John Jr. in charge of the Colorado mining interests, while his brother William came to oversee Montana mining operations. The Rockefellers' brutal and often corrupt business practices caused them to be reviled across the West. Here are just a few of the many cartoons that illustrate the level of disgust most Westerners held for the Rockefellers. But for the Donahoe family, it was deeply personal. With the takeover of the Anaconda Company, the Rockefellers ruthlessly fired Michael Donahoe. And in 1901, Michael and his family were sent into exile, away from their comfortable home and life in Anaconda. On the screen, you see just a snippet of the kind of coverage given to the Rockefeller takeover. Clearly, the Donahoes would have despised the Rockefellers. But by late 1914, after nearly 15 years of Rockefeller control and domination, things in Montana had begun to change. Why is that? In the previous spring of 1914, an atrocity was committed by troops and private security guards controlled by Rockefeller Jr. The guards opened fire using automatic weapons on striking Colorado coal miners, killing 25 people, including 11 children. This event became known as the Ludlow Massacre. Evicted from their company-owned houses, over 1,200 Ludlow miners and their families were forced to live in tents on open ground. In the massacre, their tents were firebombed, and the fleeing crowds were sprayed with automatic weapons. The pictures shown here capture just some of the extent of the horrors, including the slaughter of women and children. Overall, it is estimated that 200 people perished in what was called the Coalfield Wars of 1914. As news of the Ludlow Massacre became known, many members of Congress called for the Rockefeller mines to be taken over and nationalized. A federal commission led by attorney Frank Walsh investigated and placed the full blame for the Ludlow Massacre on the Rockefellers. The Walsh Report's findings were covered widely by the Montana newspapers in 1915, and these stories often appeared next to the stories touting Butte's payroll. The aftermath of the massacre and the congressional investigations were of vital concern to Montana's mining industry and to the future business leaders like Harry and Charles Donahoe. As the negative publicity continued, the Rockefellers tried a new tactic. They pledged to create a charity, the Rockefeller Foundation, and make it the wealthiest source of philanthropy ever seen. However, this was immediately seen as a thinly veiled attempt to stave off any further government regulation and investigation of their massive empire. In writing The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, Fitzgerald perfectly captured the arrogance of Rockefeller's plan to absolve themselves of the atrocities by creating a charity. Fitzgerald wrote, "And now he, Emperor of Diamonds, King and Priest of the Age of Gold, would offer up a treasure such as princes before him had never dreamed of. He would give to God the greatest diamond in the world, and in return he asked for only one simple thing: let him have his slaves once more." On one level, Butte's payroll is a phrase that simply refers to the significant pay increases of 1915. But more broadly, it exemplified the profound changes following the Ludlow massacre and other events in Montana and the Walsh investigation. These events deeply affected the Donahoe family. And through his connection with the Donahoes, Fitzgerald experienced firsthand the effects of class warfare. Fitzgerald drew on his Montana experiences, and in writing The Diamond, he created a powerful critique of greed and avarice as exemplified by the Rockefellers' ruthless pursuit of riches.
As mentioned earlier, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz is one of a handful of Fitzgerald stories in which there is a significant presence of African Americans. Fitzgerald scholars have attributed the presence of Black Americans to a variety of sources, but never to his visit to Montana. But White Sulphur Springs was home to an extraordinary African American family, well documented by Michael K. Johnson in 2 of his recent books on Taylor and Rose Gordon. Rose Gordon was the family's only daughter. She was a highly respected member of the community. Rose and her mother Anna ran a cafe on Main Street and catered for prominent families. Note her business card listing fancy dinners as specialty. It is likely that Anna and Rose in 1915 were providing meals for the 5 men staying at the castle. The Stone Castle visitors may also have been frequenting her cafe. Taylor Gordon is the most well-known of the 4 Gordon brothers. He worked as a chauffeur from 1908 to 1910 for John Ringling, the great circus king who owned the largest ranch in the White Sulphur Springs area. Later, Taylor Gordon became Ringling's valet. Here are a few examples from Fitzgerald's Diamond that may have been influenced by interactions with the Gordon family. For instance, all of the Gordon brothers were 5 to 6 inches taller than Fitzgerald. At least 2 of the Gordons worked as chauffeurs, and Anna Gordon was a former slave from Kentucky. The Donahoes had been coming to White Sulphur Springs for more than 12 years and would have known the Gordon family well. Undoubtedly, Fitzgerald had interactions with the Gordons at the cafe, at the castle, or in fact anywhere in the small town of just 500 people. We know from local papers that both John Ringling and Taylor Gordon were in White Sulphur Springs the same summer during Fitzgerald's stay. Shown here is the Pullman car that the Ringlings and Gordon traveled in. After his 1915 trip, Taylor Gordon left Ringling's employ to pursue a renowned singing career in New York City. Thus, the profile of the Gordon family members, and there are so many more details we could go over, do perfectly fit many of Fitzgerald's descriptions in Diamond. And there really is no need to look beyond Montana for inspirations for Fitzgerald's descriptions of African Americans. So let us summarize our conclusions regarding Fitzgerald's trip to Montana and its influence on The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. Previously, it was thought that F. Scott Fitzgerald had a cowboy summer in Montana and that his visit only tangentially influenced the writing of Diamond as Big as the Ritz. Instead, by depending on local sources, we know he primarily had a town experience. He connected with wealthy families, he interacted with a noteworthy Black family, he learned about Montana's unique history and copper economy, and was influenced by ongoing labor strife and class conflict. Yes, he did play cowboy a little bit, but it's clear that his Diamond story has deep and broad connections to Montana's mining industry. And in turn, his summer in Montana with the Donahoes contributed to his literary themes on wealth and privilege that culminated in The Great Gatsby only 3 years later. We believe this revised perspective on Fitzgerald and The Diamond as Big as the Ritz is an important part of Montana's literary history, and the hidden story of the Donahoe family deserves a more prominent place in Montana's history as well. We do want to take a quick moment to thank all of our sources for their help with materials, documents, and illustrations, and we'll be visiting all of you more in the near future. So finally, thank you all for being here today and hearing about our ongoing work.